Buddy, I am the unplanned host for this, apparently. Because I've had the pleasure of working with Matt a little bit through some of our Prescott Audubon projects. Matt, I don't recall any of your educational background or anything like that, so you can fill in the important stuff if you choose, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks. I do know that Matt worked for a number of years with the Nature Conservancy, and he's put up with the city and all its underfunded, understaffed work. City, so he was not available for some time, so we finally captured him, and we're happy to have you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Well, good evening, everybody. As you mentioned, my name is Matt Killeen. I'm the environmental coordinator for the city of Prescott. And while that sounds like a very all-encompassing job title, it actually was purely created to deal with surface water, and the rest of the environmental concerns kind of got thrown into the junk drawer that is my job description. So, but before I came here to give a little bit of the background of some of the formative steps along my career, starting probably after I returned from the Peace Corps in the bottom right, I was one of the first park rangers at the Gilbert Riparian Preserve. So got to see that come into fruition and all the challenges associated with creating a new facility like that. That was a tumbleweed forest for a number of years because those invasive species like those disturbed soils. But what it's become has been really kind of an inspirational tale that sticks in the back of my mind as I embrace the opportunities that we have now with the city. After that, in the top right corner, I spent 5 years on the east end of Aravaipa Canyon. And so as I was going down, my focus was always on what was on the ground. So as you folks came and had your eyes to the canopy, I was looking at the native fish and the frogs. Those were the areas I really focused on extensively. But as we walked down that creek, you would alternate between grayhawk, blackhawk, and zone-tailed hawk nests. And so, yeah, that was a magical place and time. After that, I had to settle. I met my wife, and we had to find that kind of area where I was out in the wilderness, but as a mental health counselor, she needed a population. So that's kind of a tough balance to find, but we found it in southeast Arizona, and I was based out in the bottom left, Ramsey Canyon Preserve, for 5 years there, and then I moved to the Patagonia Sonoda Creek Preserve as well. So it was, in that picture we're doing native fish monitoring, and when I was there is when Matt Brown and Robin Baxter documented the first Sinaloan wren in North America. And so it was about 100 yards behind me in that picture where it was located. But I got to see some of the power of what birding can do for a small town community. And some of the gathering grounds owners at the time had just bought the place. And they was having dinner with them one night, and they said if it hadn't been for that bird, they would have gotten out of business. And so that's one of the real tangible examples of some of the ecotourism benefits that are really are present in your friends, your family, and small town communities like that, or other places where these cool critters come from. And then we moved here to Prescott, Arizona about 10 years ago. I was doing mostly consulting for the Malpai Borderlands group, but then decided I needed to practice interviewing, and I got the first thing I interviewed for. Yeah. I'm still wondering if it was the right choice, but so I'm going to talk about what's happened since I moved here, me and my family, and I've got more content than time. So I am going to kind of speed through some of this stuff because some of it's a little bit of a regulatory backdrop, that most of you probably are familiar with, if not fluent in. But to get to the stuff in the second half of the presentation of kind of where the city is now, what some of our challenges are, what some of the opportunities are, and where you all can play into that in one form or another. And so with that, this job, as I mentioned, was really focused on surface water, and we know the water cycle and how it works in a natural setting. We're often seeking those out as they are the good habitat. And what happens as we see development are those pervious and natural surfaces get quickly replaced by the impervious. And so there are more pollutants, and it's the ecosystem services that would normally break them down aren't present because they're 3 feet under pavement, or the natural channels have been replaced with gray infrastructure. And with that, we see this surge of impervious areas that really represent the surge of us and all the junk we bring with us. And that has really significant impacts on the surface waters that flow all through town, and the lakes that receive those waters as well. And so speaking to that, essentially, those pollutants are getting scrubbed off. First flush is going straight into our creeks. There's no treatment available. So that oil spill in the driveway, the dog waste that's not picked up, the trash juice, all that stuff is kind of coming together and heading down towards our creeks. So with that comes problems. And 51 years ago, 52, the Clean Water Act went into place for the industrial problems that were found back east, Midwest, all over really. And it took a while for that to manifest itself at Arizona at a place like Prescott. They looked at some of those bigger waters and the bigger cities before they started looking at smaller cities like Prescott. And a while back, 2002, the Environmental Protection Agency said, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, you are now responsible for enforcing the Clean Water Act in this state. And so with that, they created what is known as the MS4 permit program system, NPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And so this is the permit that the city operates under. And some of the older towns in the back east, there were combined sewers where your stormwater runoff would go into the same place that your sanitary sewer went. So it got treated at that treatment plant at Sundog or at the airport. Here, we don't have that. We've got the two separate systems. And so anything that drops in the street is going to end up in the creek untreated. And that leads to multiple pollutants. Part of the MS4 program is they build these kind of categories. They're called minimum control measures. And so this is what I was truly brought into the city to manage and build. We were partially established across all of these things when I came in. And we had to figure out how do we want to build this to meet the permit requirement and to be sustainable for future staff, and to be meaningful for permit compliance, but also for water quality. The two are not always one and the same. And so these are the different ones. So tonight, we're smack dab at minimum control measure 1 with the outreach. Yay. And if you take some of the things I have at the end in terms of ways of publicly engaging, you'll be engaging in the public involvement MCM2. And so one example of the others is just, so every bit of new commercial and subdivision that comes in has to treat their stormwater. And there's a bunch of different ways they do that. And we have to continually monitor that on an annual basis going forward. And so there are all kinds of mechanisms, from filters that go into your storm drain that capture a lot of it. A lot of times that they'll have properties in there, polypropylene and other materials that actually attract all of the oils and hydrocarbons that are found from our vehicles. and it'll attach to that, and you have to throw that out eventually and then replace it. There's mechanical separators that all the sediment drops into this sump, and this prevents floatables from going down the storm drain towards the creek. This is actually Superstition Meaderies out by the airport. Some people will combine building requirements for stormwater quantity with stormwater quality. So as a new development goes in, the rate of flow leaving that project can't exceed what was there before it was developed. And so a lot of people, because we have big parcels in most of town, will use things like a detention basin. And that's what they have here. And if you increase or elevate the outfall of it, that first flush, which is the ½ inch of rainfall across all the impervious area, stays there and percolates into the ground. Now, ideally, we'd be feeding trees with that nitrogen and phosphorus and any E. coli that might be there. But that's just another approach that people can take. So there's numerous options, but every single new development you see in town has this going on behind the scenes. And we are inspecting it on an annual basis. But we've got our work cut out for us. All these orange and red lines on here are indicators of all our polluted waterways. So basically everything. Willow Creek is not listed because at the period of data collection, it was too dry for there to be enough water to sample. If there was, it would probably be E. coli positive as well. And that list is pretty extensive. So, like I said, every creek that feeds into Watson Lake has been identified as impaired for E. coli. A lot of the data collection came from the early 2000s, which was a relatively dry period, which had some real challenges in terms of water quality. When you have stagnant pools, they generally aren't as healthy as flowing water would be. And that was really evident when Granite Creek got a dissolved oxygen. It's not something you would expect. Our creek bottoms are coarse enough that they should be well oxygenated. To my mind, that's really more of an indication of kind of low flow periods and stagnant pools being sampled rather than that. I'm not worried about that. That's an easy one to fix of all the things we're dealing with here. And contrary to popular belief, our lakes are not impaired for E. coli. In the realm that I work in, the kind of favored catchphrase is the solution to pollution is dilution. The more of that fresh water, snow melt, and other things that we can get in there, the better. And it actually does work in the case of E. coli. By the time we get down to the lakes, that goes well below the surface water quality standard for full body contact. But what we do have in both lakes are kind of a pollutant load of historic proportions. The good news is that Willow Creek is scheduled to have, well, it's not scheduled, it's proposed to have its impairment for ammonia removed. ADEQ is proposed that. ADEQ every couple of years has to send a list to EPA and said, this is the progress we're making on these waters. This is what we are suggesting gets delisted. These are new waters that we've identified as polluted for one thing or another. And so Willow Lake will be losing its ammonia impairment. And I actually talked with a colleague of mine, and he mentioned he worked out at Prescott Lakes during the period of its development, and it coincided with the data collection there. So in the early days of Prescott Lakes, they really wanted those golf courses to be super green, like Ireland, so that it would bring in home buyers. And so he worked on the golf courses and talked about the extent to which they over-fertilize many of those places. And they run down directly into Willow Lake. So more recently, they found that that's no longer a pollutant of concern. We still have to worry about harmful algal blooms there, but from the regulatory perspective, if EPA approves it, we'll be in better shape. One down, 15 to go. So because of those impairments, the state is obligated to make a game plan on how to address that. And those are referred to as total maximum daily load documents, or TMDLs. And what this does is it goes through and it looks at where the pollutants are potentially coming from, who's responsible for how much of the pollutants, and it actually kind of creates a menu by which they allocate how much pollution everybody's responsible for. So they have these waste load allocations. And because of, let me go back. Because of the city's geographic location, and we're the source of the majority of the pollution, not all by any means, but a good portion of it, we're responsible for something like 70% of the pollutant loads for both the lake and the E. coli waste load totals. So these are documents that are intended to be renewed every 5 years, and this is the most current one we have. So DEQ's been dragging their feet a little bit. They have, if they had done it on time, let's see, that would have been 2020, so none of our waters were protected back then because of the previous administration's dirty water rule. So that kind of dropped it down. We also had a number of other things kind of going on, keeping us busy in 2020 with the pandemic. So they are hiring consultants to look at this again, and we're looking forward to participating in this to really get back into the numbers, and let's make sure that this is a current and modern take on the pollutants we have in our watershed and in our city. On the heels of that, the TMDL documents, the city said, okay, we need to get busy. ADEQ told us that we needed to get busy. And that's right when I started with the city, about 2015, 2016 timeframe. And so we looked at it for both TMDLs and created this action plan. And so it was basically 5 years of fairly extensive work with consultants on looking at sources of pollutants, how pollutants are transported, what are some of the best management practices and tools that we can deploy as a city so that we are most effectively treating these pollutants. It's definitely a measure twice, cut once kind of approach that the city had. And so some of those things included, since all of our creeks are impaired for E. coli, we looked at microbial source tracking. So what species are contributing what amount of E. coli where? And there was a pretty significant amount of variation. One of the things that we actually did as part of that, hadn't been done before, according to our consultants, was that they sequenced javelina poop to figure out how much javelina we're contributing. Because if you think about our waterways, particularly when they're dry, they are the highways for our mule deer, for a lot of our critters. And so javelinas are often, having their little mud baths, they poop in groups, it's all that kind of stuff. We wanted to make sure that we were counting that into the equation as well. And our biggest hit across the board was human from aged septic systems and sanitary sewer systems, but then also ungulate or mule deer. Those were the ones that really jumped off the page. But we did pick up some interesting, there's some canine ones here, so we can look at things like, where do we put the dog waste bags and things like that. We also looked at street dirt. The way that street dirt itself, sediment, is a pollutant in its own right, but it actually serves as the vector for other pollutants. And so nitrogen will jump onto a particle size of this big, phosphorus on this one, and so forth. And so by understanding the different sizes of street dirt, we could actually tailor our sweeping program and other things to hit those areas to be a little bit more efficient. And we also looked pretty extensively at Watson Lake. I think particularly in recent years, everybody's been out there in the summer and we've seen what it can look like, and I'll have photos of that later. We've got a pretty significant nutrient impairment. It was called the most eutrophic nitrogen or nutrient-rich lake in the state back in the 80s, and it hasn't changed a whole lot in that regard. one of the things that happened previously before the city owned it is that the lake would actually get drawn down and topsoil was harvested. And that actually helped reduce some of the nutrients. Since that time, when we don't do those practices, it's allowed kind of a negative feedback cycle of nutrients just to build and build. So we've got a jackpot of nutrients in the lake, and then more that gets dosed every time we get spring runoff or monsoon rains. And so we did a year-long data analysis, 5 different stations across the lake, looking at a bunch of things. The oxygen level, a significant portion of that lake is really uninhabitable to fish. And so thinking about just angling and, again, ecotourism and potential. Also, this is our future drinking water. And so, thinking about how we can make improvements here to make it a better experience for everybody today and tomorrow is kind of the driving goal that we had in going down this road. And that's the culmination of all of those technical studies ended up on these 2 management plans, which are both on the city's newly revamped website. So definitely check that out. And I would just like to reinforce that these really are kind of the public-facing side of it. This is not at that technical memo level of discourse and analysis that we had done for many of it. We don't get in, we reference like the street dirt sampling, but we don't break down exactly what is where in these documents. This is the overview document, kind of an executive summary, if you will. And that's what, in my time here, has transitioned us from that measure twice now to doing some more of the cutting and bringing some of the recommended ideas and practices into place. And then just the real world need. This was September of this year. This was the Monday following the Celtic Festival, I want to say. I might be off on that one. There were a lot of people out there, and a lot of them going down, and we didn't dye the lake green for them. This is textbook harmful algal blooms. So we work with the rec services for them to post signs, warning people as such. But the spilt paint look in the left, the grass clippings in the right, if you could see a little bit closer, look more like that. This is gross, and this is not healthy either. And this is something, for just about everybody in here, it's not going to take us out. But toddlers and pets, vulnerable populations like that, where you're not just touching the water, it's all over you, it's in you, it's everywhere. They are the truly vulnerable ones here, and so trying to improve it so that we don't have to worry about that going forward is the goal. And to better understand what was going on there, we actually participated as beta testers for an EPA remote sensing program. It's really cool. You can go into this Cyan web. They've got mobile apps now for this. And so if you were a paddler and you say you were going to go to one of our reservoirs or Blue Ridge Reservoir over by Payson or any number of others, you can actually drop a dot and see what the cyanotoxin levels are there. It's not only detecting them, it's also quantifying them. And so it was cool because we were on the smaller scale, our lakes were, of kind of detectability in this. And so it was cool to be part of that process, to work with the EPA and say, hey, is this working for you? And it's like, yes, we need this kind of real-time data so that we can, in the future, better inform the visitors that are coming here, and so that they can make informed decisions, or we can just prohibit some uses if need be. So that's a really cool one. If you like to geek out on stuff, it's a good one. So one of the things, one of the last lake presentations I made was at council when we were bringing this contract to city council with regards to so for the lake, 3 main tools to really improve the water quality there. In lake, there's the watershed side, but for the in lake, it's aeration, it's some weed harvesting component, and then also phosphorus treatment. So the first one that we bit off was the aerators. And again, similar to the other watershed pollution reduction plan and the lake management plan, we've looked at all of our options before coming to this. And I didn't expect to come here. I thought we were going to have the submerged hoses that were going to bubble up, and that was going to be it. The reality is the lake's not suited for that because of the stretch of it, because of where we have power. There's logistical issues as well. We would have had to run heavy-duty power lines on multiple places to the lake's edge, and then have large compressor stations near the area that people visited on a regular basis. It also costs 3 times as much just for the startup, and that doesn't include all of the electrical work and other engineering and consulting that was going to need to happen. These are plug and play, and they're solar powered, and so they're working 24 hours a day. They also are great for us in that many of you have probably looked at the ducks at the Sundog wastewater treatment ponds or the waterfowl, and you see the little floating things out there. This is just a bigger version of the same thing. So one of the things that does is that we already have in-house experience on how to maintain it. Now these are warranted and maintained by the company for 15 years. They're scheduled to arrive and be installed Friday, Saturday of this week. So I'll be out there as well. So yeah, it's going to take a while. And so the locations of them are identified. Where am I? Gotta find me. These are the areas that they'll be put in. And coincidentally, that also is really close to the testing locations that ADEQ established and other consultants have established historically, and that will be used going forward as well. And so we're trying to treat that full length of Watson Lake with it. And so this aerates through the circulation of it. It's not directly injecting oxygen into it, but by creating that movement, you get oxygenation through wind movement and other activity at the top, and it's displacing the deoxygenated or anoxic water towards the bottom. And like I said, I didn't think we were going to go this route, but this is where we are. And that was one of the things I mentioned in that council presentation, was that it's not for me to emotionally or subjectively pick what the best solution is in these places. We should be looking at what data and analysis tells us. And like I said, I was thinking we'd go somewhere else. This is where we ended, and so we're going to pay attention. We're going to try to monitor it, adaptive management, see how it works or doesn't, and take it forward. I fully expect it to work. There's a pretty extensive track record of these devices across. Yes?
Are these stationary or do they move around?
They are stationary. They have mooring blocks that we have to get permitted through the Corps of Engineers. And so those are relatively permanent stations. They are made for a high wave capacity because, as a little bit of that graph shows us down on the bottom, we're just about 3.5 feet below spillway in Watson right now. And so 2 weeks ago, we were probably about 9 feet below spill. So all this snow melt, all this storm is coming. And so they have to have the ability to deal with that. And that was part of the consideration. And they have stuff that's specifically designed for that kind of either, not tidal, but kind of those shifts that we would see here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And we're gonna kind of have to learn as we go. So I don't know if I say it in the next one. Yeah, so so that's what it looks like. I haven't seen one in person that is designed for this kind of use. I've seen the ones at the wastewater treatment plant, same kind of mechanism. It's all solar powered. The ones at the wastewater treatment plant, I think our superintendent there mentioned one of them had a battery replaced. Other than that, they've been hands off for their lifespan there. So from a costs and operation perspective, it makes it much easier for us.
And Matt, why don't you take my question?
Sure.
Is Watson Lake the only place in this week that these are going to be used?
Yeah.
And then a follow-up, how much does each individual one cost and where are they manufactured?
So the company has an office out of Phoenix. and they're driving them up on Friday. The total for all 3 of them, this is very much ballpark, so don't quote me on it. I want to say it was in the $360,000 for all 4 units. That includes transport, construction, and deployment.
So they have an office, but where are they manufactured?
I don't know that off the top of my head. Yeah.
I did the research after your last meeting and they're manufactured in the United States
Okay, thanks.
with parts from everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there limitations as far as the depth that is affected with these units, depth of the water?
So one of the things that's kind of cool about it, yeah, I mean, in the shallows, there is going to be a limited southern deployment position because of the shallowness of it. So the yellow tubes that you see there come in 10-foot increments. And so they'll place it based on some of the topography maps that we have and their expertise. And in some areas, we can also add additional, like towards the dam, we could, in theory, add an additional hose to get a more thorough mixing in that area as well. So that's what it'll look like. And so this, just the kind of coordination that takes place, all of our reservoirs are multiple kind of benefit resources. They're critical to our water recharge that happens out at the airport. Recreation, they're of huge value for people that are walking the shores, walking dogs, paddling, fishing, all that stuff. And one of the things we're really making an effort is to work in a more coordinated fashion so that when it comes to these things, just internally, the city is helping each other out a little bit more. So last week, I went over to Rec Services and dealt with their frontline staff so that they knew what is coming. They could ask me all the questions they expected to get. And then I'll go back and say, okay, what are you hearing? What's going on? These are actually temporary signs that we're kind of testing out, but just want to have something on the ground at all of the access points to the lake. So these will be on display as soon as those devices are placed in the lake so that we're communicating with the visiting public so they know what to expect. It's going to take some lumps here and there in terms of making sure we don't have people climbing on stuff. Yeah, we'll take it as it comes in that regard. And through outreach education, hopefully we can cover most of those issues. So one of the other main ones that was brought up and maybe even a little bit more spirited at the city council meeting was the concept of herbivorous fish for weed harvesting. To me, this makes the most sense for a bunch of different reasons, but it's not easy to achieve. The alternative, just for context, would be something you see in Midwestern lakes quite a bit more often. It's a weed harvester. It's a lawnmower for your lake. And the problem with that is that's a big, expensive outlay of cash right there. So that's a relatively small scale one. If we had something like that for Watson, it's kind of like the bridge that's continuously getting painted. That would be happening at the lake. And so then you have basically a dedicated staff person bringing our own mechanics up to snuff on whether or not they can, diagnose those issues or not. And then there's questions of, well, what do you do with all that stuff then? And so initially I was pursuing that and looking about, they refer to it as closing the nutrient loop. And what may be a nuisance to you could be a resource for somebody else. How can you connect those two? Pardon me. And so I was reaching out to farmers to figure out what we can do to utilize this displaced chemical fertilizer use. It's rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, so let's put it to use. It wasn't practical at that time for a number of reasons. Farmers need to have definitive information with regards to quantities, nutrient components. When they buy the 10-5-6 or whatever it is fertilizer, they know exactly what they're getting. With this stuff, it's going to be variable based on species, time of year, and all those things. And so I think that there are opportunities out there. I wasn't in a place to fully embrace them or able to embrace them at the moment. The challenge with the fish is the regulatory obstacles. And so talking about multiple use resource, it's also a multiply regulated resource as well. And so we've got game and fish need to see a closed system. Arizona Department of Water Resources want to make sure our dam remains safe. FEMA wants to make sure that whatever we do on the dam to keep the fish in the dam doesn't flood anybody else out. And if any one of them doesn't like the other person's idea, we're back to the drawing board. So it's an iterative process. And honestly, I don't know if we can get there or not. One of the biggest concerns that were raised at the previous council meeting was with regards to the native fishery in the Upper Verde River. And having worked with the 7 native fish species in Aravaipa Creek, done fish surveys in Sonoita Creek as well, I'm acutely aware of the significance of that resource and how rare it is. And it may be somewhat counterintuitive, but by putting these white amur, these grass herbivorous fish in, it's actually doing more to protect those native fish than what we have right now. What we have right now are thousands of sport fish that are predatory. Bass, some trout, catfish, and there is no boundary between them and the Verde River. And so Game and Fish has this kind of dual reality where it's okay to populate sport fish in this lake, irregardless of the potential consequences to native fish down below. But for something that could actually improve water quality that they've talked about in fisheries management plans for over a decade, we have to make sure it's a closed system according to Arizona Administrative Code. So we are pursuing the herbivorous fish. It's just going to take a while to get there. It's not going to be easy. Some of the reviews that those regulatory agencies have can be a year. And this isn't rocket science. It's figuring out how do we put barriers up that don't compromise dam safety, but also keep the fish in. These are riverine fish, so typically, this isn't like a slot canyon where they're getting blown out of when we have flood. It's a giant, slow-moving lake, maybe faster at some times. But they tend to point their head upstream and know how to deal with the kind of flooding issues. So that's one of the next things that's on my list of things to do, is to figure out how to get those fish in. And then the other kind of tool in the triumvirate there is the phosphorus treatments. So while phosphorus wasn't identified as a pollutant and exceedance of any standard, because of its nature as a catalyst for all this kind of bad stuff to happen, they added it to the TMDL. And there's a couple of different treatments that you can do. One is very pixelatedly pictured here. There we are. So Phoslock is a commercial name of one. It's lanthanum impregnated bentonite. Alum is another one. And what happens is when that gets sprayed in with like a giant weed sprayer into the lake, it binds to the phosphorus so it's not bioavailable, and it creates that white flocculant that just drops it out and settles down to the bottom. So that kind of takes that energizer catalyst out of the system so that we don't see as much of that primary growth that happens with that nutrient-rich soup. So that will come down the road, and working with a consultant that did a lot of the testing here, they also are the ones that manage Tempe Town Lake and get it suitable for Ironman triathlons and things like that. So they have a very long and well-respected history in lake management in Tempe, the Valley, and up here as well. For watershed pollution, so we can do all those things in the lake if we don't do stuff up here in the watershed. We're just going to be doing those things in the lake more often. And so how do we make sure that we're not sending as many pollutants downstream? That plan put out a whole host of kind of best management plans. I talked about the street sweepers being a little bit smarter about that. One of the ways we diverged a little bit is the consultants, the experts in this really prefer one type of street sweeper, a vacuum or regenerative sweeper. But the ones that we use are a little bit different. They're more, I don't think this is the one. They're called broom bears. And so they're better with just more particulate matter. They're not as complete in their cleanup of it. So we initially went with what consultants recommended, but that thing was at the fleet shop on a regular basis and not out doing the work. And so we were able to move to the one that's not in the shop as often. It's something that our fleet mechanics can repair. We don't have to ship down to the valley. And so as a result, we're seeing a lot more lane miles cleaned. Yeah.
What do they do with all the stuff they pick up?
It goes to landfill. So it gets dumped at the Sundog transfer station. They get weighed, they dump, and then they go back out.
And what do they do with it at the transfer station?
It gets taken to the landfill.
Out to 169?
That's the one up, yeah, I forget the name of that one. Yep, yeah, that sounds right. Yep. Yeah, so we pay for that through our solid waste. Well, no, actually, that doesn't go through the solid waste, but that's part of the city operations as we budget for and plan for. The other way that I'm really hoping to focus more on, and I'm moving in that direction, is rethinking how we deal with things in the neighborhood scale and broadening that. And that really has a focus on green stormwater infrastructure is what it's called. And it's basically a way of kind of reinserting nature and ecosystem services at the neighborhood level. And so that we have rain gardens and porous pavements so we don't have as much runoff. We value street trees as dissipating some of the erosive nature of water and cooling as well, if we wanted to think about some of the long-term climate change sustainability concepts as well. These are all in line with it. And so we are doing that in a number of ways. One that came to fruition more recently was the channel work that was done as part of the Granite Creek corridor work. And there was a lot of attention paid to kind of our human interaction with it, with signage, with trails, with accessibility, which are all great, with safety, security. But we also took a really deep look at the fluvial geomorphology of that creek and what we can do to make it a healthier creek, less erosive. And that still has portions yet to be done. Because of the delays of last spring, we didn't get the plantings, the willow pole plantings done in time this year. So that's it's still coming. But looking at the structure of the creek channel, what we can do with cross vein weirs and other structures, similar to what Michael Bird has utilized at Watson Wood Riparian Preserve. We can do that, and it can help oxygenate the water and prevent it from becoming a multi-braided and erosive channel. That's a fun group to work with. They do a lot of pretty interesting projects. They're out of Flagstaff, and they dealt with a lot of the post-fire issues that Flagstaff saw, and how do they fix some of those streams that just get absolutely demolished in the aftermath of those fires and all those hydrophobic soils. Yeah.
You mentioned one side effect is it reduces a huge amount of the phosphorus in the sediment.
Yeah, absolutely. And then green stormwater infrastructure. This is one of my go-to pictures. It's a little bit older, so I'm sure many people here have seen it many times. This is at the rodeo grounds, and our main pollutants of concern are E. coli and then nitrogen. And there's a ton of it there with all that livestock. And so this was put into place right about 2016-ish timeframe. And there's a sediment forebay kind of at the upper end of that sinuous channel. And so the sediment would actually drop out there. And in the early days of this action, we would weigh or quantify the amount of sediment we were pulling out of that on an annual basis to report back to ADEQ. This was funded in part by Department of Environmental Quality. And we also did a fair amount of water quality analysis. And what we found in places like this, the Adult Center on Rosser, Taco Basin, also known as Whipple Basin, most of those areas we can see in a storm like this, a 50% reduction in E. coli as it goes through this sinuous channel. And so we were working with DEQ, Ron Tiller, who's been doing a lot of work up at Oak Creek more recently, to document this and figure out what can we do to tweak the design of these systems so that they are more effective in becoming pollutant sinks and putting them towards the beneficial use of feeding native and drought-tolerant plants at the same time. This is one that there's a lot of opportunities, and they come from different kind of angles. And so Yavapai County Flood Control District has been working with the city, and every year they identify projects cooperatively to fund. This is one in Acker Park. If you were to drive up past the main parking lot by the Oddfellows Cemetery, it's right over there. And so this is one that has water quantity, water quality, and then benefits. And it was also kind of a creative funding mechanism in that the subdivision above it had obligations for stormwater control, and they realized that they were losing sellable parcels or lots to creating stormwater detention ponds within their subdivision. And they said, hey, we would rather have the money here. Can we give you money so that we don't have to do that? And our city code actually is somewhat forward-thinking in that regard, in that it allows for a fee in lieu of detention. And it allows for things like this regional detention where we can look at things at scale rather than a single neighborhood scale. So this is actually a really cool aspect of our city code that we haven't used all that much, but I'd like to see it. We need to update it and then hopefully put it into use a little bit more. So that was the early kind of Brown days, but it really does come to life and is full of it. Regularly see, again, my eyes are on the ground, so mountain lion, scat, bobcats, coyotes, deer, javelina, all throughout there. And there's a pair of mallards that kind of hit any pond in town, and they're kind of, they'll show up as well. And but it's really sprung to life well. And now on the other side of the hill, the Penn Eastwood has a pretty rough looking basin in place right now. And it's something that when I look at that site, I see potential similar to what we have here. And one of the things that we don't have in place yet is a real solid plan for what the bottom of that basin is going to look like. But because they retain water so well, it's a real opportunity to create a riparian oasis. And so that's one of the things that's on my plate to be working on. And it's hopefully a place where we'll be able to recruit some volunteers in the not too distant future this spring to help with some of the early days, some of the crowd pleasers like willow and cottonwood pole plantings and things like that. And so that should be coming down the pike. There's also a fair number of spots where we've done retrofits for this green stormwater infrastructure. So this is this was put in place shortly before my arrival, and it had all of the best intentions, but it had some critical points that weren't quite 100%, or it was a new enough concept that it wasn't done just right. And so we see some of those little failure points, whether it's a low water crossing that's using PVC rather than just a dipped crossing there. One of the things you can't really see here, if you were to walk by it today, these were all the plantings that took place early on and did well okay, but they didn't have a definitive and guided maintenance program. We can create these all over the place really easily. I have 25 sites, and I'll show you those in a minute, where I could go out and build this kind of green stormwater infrastructure. But if we don't have the knowledge and the ability to maintain it, it's gonna basically devolve into a pile of decomposed granite. So this is one I'm actually going to be working on, creating a training program for city staff and reaching out to some local landscapers to utilize it as a case study and say, okay, these are what happened here. What can we do better? How would you maintain it? Learning from the folks who are the ones with their hands in the dirt on these kind of things. What makes sense to you? Learning both ways is going to be a critical component so that we're not building something they hate from the start, but something that they can understand and feel like they have buy-in on is what we would like to see. And they can understand what we're trying to achieve in this moment as well. Yeah.
Can a person ask to have assistance in setting up this sort of garden in their own yard and then maintain it?
So there are city rebates actually for passive rainwater harvesting, which this is. The adult center is actually both active and passive rainwater harvesting. And so PrescottWater.com has a great amount of resources regarding passive rainwater harvesting. CWAG has some great resources as well. And there's a lot out there. Brad Lancaster from Tucson is an incredibly inspiring person to watch, and what he's done in some of his neighborhoods down there, in his yards and elsewhere. The Watershed Management Group is another one that has an incredible resource library.
I'm just even thinking, could this city train volunteers who might be willing to actually go out to someone's yard and help them design it? And, as a means of, because yes, I've been to Seaway and I know all about passive rainwater harvesting. I try to do it myself, but I'm not a pro.
Right.
I just think that would be a great outreach for your department if you could train people to then train others who then would have their neighbors look at it.
Yeah, no, we are looking at that currently. I'm working with a consultant to figure out if we can put a training like that together. And one of the ideas would be to look at some of the sites around town that work, and the grant that I'll be describing in a minute has a virtual component to this, where we're trying to make it a little bit more informative in the ways you're describing, about showing what the strong and really functional design points of this feature is, and these are what its failure points are. And some of them you can see and some of them you can't. Oh, we didn't have a maintenance plan for this. You can't really see that, but you can see that there's no vegetation really there anymore. But that's going to be part of the grant, is an outreach component where we're going to go through and have these available so that before you come to a training, you could be doing some homework as well to understand what some of these concepts are. We do try to incorporate some of these Green Street type ideas into city capital improvement projects. Carlton Cortez was built about 4 or 5 years ago. I was having a conversation earlier, and if it's not there at the beginning, it's really hard to slap it in at the end, particularly with big projects like this. So if you're not in that scoping process of what this project is designed to be, you're going to have a hard time getting it put in there. I got brought into this one at about 90% plans, which represents probably a couple of years worth of work. We were able to install some green stormwater infrastructure elements into it. They're suboptimal because they couldn't go back and look at hydraulics and all the other engineering considerations that went into it. So it's better than nothing, but it's not great. And so working to get this established in more of the city's capital improvement projects so that we're not using potable water to irrigate landscape planning. We're using stormwater runoff as much as possible. Is one of the goals. And it's the type of thing that the general plan has in their purview to consider going forward. And so thinking back about some of the ways that you can participate in seeing things like this that conserve water, that increase native healthy habitat, thinking about, well, should the general plan be considering a green streets policy, so that we have this considered for every single project going forward. So, and that ties into what my grant from ADEQ is. It's called a 640B, which is just some bizarre subsection of some funding mechanism from EPA. And the idea is, I've been chewing on this for quite a while. And so as I go through town and investigate pollution issues or inspect commercial sites, stormwater quality features, or do construction site inspections, I'm looking at places where we can do retrofits. And Brookside Boulevard is just on the creek side of where Copper Basin tees into White Spar. And we've got this broad open median right there. And you can see there's a valley gutter leading right up to it on one side. And so I started just trying to get pictures of that when it was raining to understand what the water was doing around it. And so this is a place where instead of just having this little spread of turf grass that it's there. But what could it be? Thinking about some of the landscape features that we see just outside these doors, whether it's desert willows, salvias, any number of native things that are great for pollinators, aesthetically good, reduce heat island effect, would be fed by the water that falls on the ground and not that which comes through the pipes is the goal. And so this grant is working to evaluate these 25 sites that I've kind of said, okay, what about here? What about here? And so this is very early, and we're realizing that you can get really lost in these numbers really quick. So I'm going to blow through some of this stuff because it's too much, and we realize asking everybody to go through and evaluate every one of these sites across all of this is not reasonable. We're going to get burnout. We're going to get, people just fatigued with the whole process. So we're adjusting on the fly a little bit. And the goal is to make sure that you do have input, but we're going to work with kind of technical experts. So the consultant I am working with is Kieran Sikdar. He was the primary author for the Pima County Green Stormwater Infrastructure Low Impact Development Manual that just got published within the last year. He's got a wealth of information on this. I got certified as a rainwater harvesting practitioner by the Watershed Management Group last year. We're also going to be talking with our landscape maintenance crews, our streets drainage crews, and getting their input on this as well. And what the goal is to have a short list, maybe a top 5 or a top 10. And that's when we're going to more proactively engage with the public in a number of different venues online, probably through some survey mechanism, and start looking at all these different things. But just to give you a sense of all the different categories, one of the goals here is also to have this matrix that as funding mechanisms come up, we can weight the different categories. So this is a weight rank evaluation. So the different categories are the environmental, social, financial, technical, water quality and flooding, economic priority, urgency, and stakeholder priority. Ultimately, what we're going to seek from the public is going to be how those categories should be weighed relative to one another. And so that's where you would get to say, hey, you know what, I think the social justice component of this is more important than the cost of it. This is something we're overdue to be working in these areas that we've overlooked for so long. One of the reasons this thing got funded is because it identified a third of the sites are in an area that's been described by the EPA as environmental justice screening tools disadvantaged area. And so there are multiple needs in those areas, from flooding, from water quality, to basic infrastructure that other parts of the city may not realize to the same degree. How should we weigh that versus a cost benefit? Well, just do it. You should be in there doing this stuff. You're overdue to be doing this stuff. Get in there and do it. And so that's how we'll be looking at it. But some of the technical experts will be going across it, and each one of these categories, this is the area I'll go a little bit fast. The social, traffic calming, disadvantaged area, neighborhood priority, outreach, education is also a component of it. We need to kind of share what these features are doing. Financial costs, operation and maintenance is a big part of it. You buy it once, but you maintain it for the foreseeable future. Technical. We've got a lot of hard rock just below the surface here. There's a lot of places this may not work very well, or it'll work differently. And so thinking about how that works. That disadvantaged area also has a very high rate of flooding issues as well. And so can we offset some of the nuisance flooding that happens by having this sited appropriately and weighted appropriately? Yeah.
I just wondered, with all of the development that's going around in the area, are the developers actually meeting with you, and are they receptive to these sort of mitigation measures to make their developments more water-wise and storm water retention-wise?
Yeah, so they are obligated by code, general engineering standards and land development code to do that. So they have to. And so most of the new subdivisions of scale are doing on relatively native landscapes. We're talking about North Prescott is where most of this stuff is happening. This is Granite Dells Estates, this is Walden Ranch, Antelope Crossing, those areas. All of them do have these features built into them. And most of them are utilizing detention basins and things like that to help deal with stormwater quantity and quality. So they do. They meet the requirements. Could it be better? I think I could, but that's not what they're aiming at. And so as long as they meet those code requirements, they're getting to move forward.
I once heard, in fact, it was at one of the open houses that was held in conjunction with the general plan, and Councilman Gambogi was saying that there are all of these guidelines for official developments, but where he sees the big need is in the residential areas, just all of us in this room who aren't developers, making these kind of changes in our own yards.
Yeah, and there is a lot of opportunity. And so one of the ideas behind this, most of the sites that we're looking at are city-owned or Prescott Unified School District. If you think about it, the greatest amount of opportunity is going to be with the largest landowners. And if I have to deal with 25 different landowners versus 2, we're going to get a lot farther faster with 2. And so that works in this exercise, and I think that we can get to a point where we can look at established neighborhoods and identify opportunities there. But for the time being, it is happening in those new developments, but thinking about all the established neighborhoods, that is a little bit of a tougher one to think about. Can I
ask you a question?
Yeah.
We seem to spend a lot of oxygen on talking about these ways to improve green stormwater, whatever. And a lot of questions have been asked about personal property and how to improve that. Can you, we're not going to be able to go to some course next week and get an education on how to do this with a manual and go home and make this a magical, landscape in our own property. Can you right now, if you were going to give a bullet point of 3 important things to say, hey, Mr. Homeowner, here is the 3 things that would really be effective for you to do on your property. What are those 3 things? And what is it we're not doing, and what is it we could do, or maybe might want to do, or maybe might not want to do? What is that?
So I would suggest that in the era of YouTube, that this is actually much easier than it may seem in this setting that I'm presenting right now. And there are a lot of great people out there that can show you this. Some of the key things that they talk about is when it's raining, you go out and watch what's happening. Where is your water sources, your impervious surfaces of your roof, and where do you want to plant that water? And so figuring out what areas in your yard are available. You don't want to put it right next to your wall, because the last thing you want to do is be flooding your subfloor or your basement. But where do you want to move that water safely away from your house and that you can plan it? Those are the first two big things, is where's your water source and where's your destination, and thinking about it in those terms.
Is there something about your general landscaping plan that's an important part of this whole picture that you're talking about?
It can be, but it's really where your resource and where you want to realize that benefit. And so how you want to see that on your property, I can't prescribe that for you. I can give you guidelines that suggest you want to do a swale that has a 3-to-1 side, that you want to have different plants placed at different levels of that little basin. Some like the water more than others. So there's those kind of little nuances that you can get into. And there's a lot of great resources for that, including the city's website that has a manual on how to do this in your own yard. So we've got all these different categories. And so for a water quality perspective, we want to see it where the water infiltrates completely and we don't have any pass-through. Well, as we mentioned, a lot of us from here up to the forest going south, that's going to be really challenging. Because we're just basically, a couple feet over some pretty dense granite. So thinking about those kind of considerations can make a big difference on the design components and suitability for this in those settings. Economic benefits, urgency. So this is where other things that we don't necessarily, is there another street plan already in place that's coming down the pipeline? Can we piggyback onto something that's already got some momentum behind it, or do we have to start from fresh? And then stakeholder priority is the idea where you look across these and think, I think this is a great idea. I like this one over here. And it can come from any number of reasons, whether it's a place that you see on a regular basis. I've got 3 different sites at Granite Creek Park. And so that's a place I know at least a few of you go to on a very regular basis. I eat my lunch there almost every day. And one of the most valuable things that you can contribute in this process is telling us the sites we're missing. What did we not see that you see on a regular basis? And whether it's at the neighborhood resident level, or is it some other part of town that I just don't get to as often because it's not as dirty? Or, so where are these sites that we haven't identified? We desperately want to know that too. So taking a step back, the water quality needs to happen at multiple scales to truly be effective. And one of the hotter topics is the roadway through the Dells and the widening and all that stuff. The underlying motivation for reevaluating that road surface is not the road surface itself or exclusively. It's the effluent line that transports water from Sundog Wastewater Treatment Plant to the airport. And we know that the Sundog Wastewater Treatment Plant is old and undersized for the city's needs. And by moving that effluent for treatment to the wastewater treatment plant at the airport, it's going to protect our lakes and all the creeks in this area as well. A year ago, when we were having significant overflow of the lake, we were also having significant sewer overflows in Granite Creek Park. And that was, I think, the last time I was supposed to talk. And I was going out on a daily basis and taking water quality measurements throughout town to try to document just the extent of what that pollutant bloom was in our water. And it ended up in closing the lake for a number of days. And so that kind of modernization to our sewer system is a critical piece in the background that we don't always think about when we think about our creeks and lakes. But if we don't have that, all this other stuff is almost window dressing at times.
Okay, may I?
Yeah.
When I moved here, the waste place was up on top of the hill above the wastewater treatment.
Oh, the landfill?
Landfill was up there. And of course, is there any leaching of that down into the water system?
I think you could logically presume so. I don't know so.
The trees don't grow. They tried to plant great trees up there that aren't very native.
Yeah, and the surface treatment of that is not something I've actually been on to see. Elms are growing there, but they'll grow just about anywhere. Yeah, so I haven't done any groundwater testing from leachate that's associated with it. I'm not familiar with that. I mostly stick to the surface water. We did, when we were evaluating Watson Lake and treatment strategies, we did go in and test sediment because dredging was a really popular consideration at the time. And we wanted to make sure that if we were going to go dredge, we weren't dredging up hazardous waste or uncapping hazardous waste and then having to pay additional fees for that. And we didn't have anything that tested in a hazardous waste category. So the sediment of the lake isn't showing any sign necessarily from there or previous arsenic timber plant Superfund site that was kind of close to Slaughterhouse Gulch. Slaughterhouse Gulch was a previous Superfund site. It was associated with a timber mill, but they did a pretty good job on it, and there's not any significant signature in the lake of it. But I'm not familiar with that landfill's closure or any of the testing that they've done or not done, actually.
It was full.
Yeah.
You know, there was only about, I don't know, 25,000 people.
Yeah.
In Prescott at that time, and it was just full.
Yeah.
You know, they couldn't put it anywhere, so.
Well, and Michael Bird had to deal with it with a lot of wildcat dumping down on the creek bottom as well, many years later. That was one of, when they couldn't go there or didn't want to pay to go there, there were some spots on the Watson Wood Riparian Preserve that were active dump sites. And so, yeah, that's part of our history that we're going to be living with. And there's a whole slew of emerging contaminants that we didn't know about, but we're just now beginning to. And so thinking about what we do with that kind of stuff, and it's critical.
Matt,
Yeah.
my recent grant research has been focused on the environment, watershed, and the future of communities. And I'm finding the preponderance of grantors, foundations especially, leaning towards watershed improvements. What, and you and I have talked, but I'd like for you to expand, what are the short and long-term limitations that you're feeling that affect the future of Prescott's watershed?
I think if we don't have direction from council to do so, we're pushing the ball uphill. And so council needs to know this is important to the residents that it represents, first and foremost. The city is more and more cognizant of the need to build capacity for it, but that is also subject to budget requests and personnel requests. And so that is an ongoing issue that we work at on a continual basis in the background while all this stuff's happening. From the grant writing perspective, there's a lot out there. There's grants I didn't go for this year simply because of capacity issues, but it aligns with it. Basically, it would tear right after this, the green stormwater, it would start building some of that stuff. And so making sure we have the capacity to seize those opportunities is a key issue. I've done this kind of work in Southern Arizona, and I've seen some of the cool. Southern Arizona has a lot of really progressive and dynamic people when it comes to watershed management and health, borderlands restoration. USGS is doing an incredible job of documenting the benefits from not only increasing the permanence of water spatially, but over time as well. There are carbon sinks. There's a lot of these structures that we can deploy in significant portions of our city and that which is about to become our city when you think about the new acquisitions of Glassford Hill. So there is a lot of opportunity. It's just figuring out how to capture it is the challenge.
Yeah, I recently, and I won't have the time here, but shared a lot of amazing information that I discovered with people in the city of Brookline. Oh, we didn't know that. Putting it all in terms of raw data of where the money is, and none of it's coming to Prescott. But we're fortunate to have people from CWAG, to have you, I'm on the general plan, I was on the mayor's water committee. But I think as a group, this community needs to come together, forget about who's not doing something right in council and say, this is what we want.
The scope and the scale of the work is possible with that, it can be increased with that kind of energy and direction. Yeah.
This will be my last, but I'm just thinking, given the audience that's here tonight, and the fact that birding in this area is a big draw economically as well as just for enjoyment, what do you see as the primary project that we should be advocating for bird health in our region?
The general plan is really a critical tool that the city is going to be using for a decade. And I think some of the current general plan's weaknesses are going to propel it to hopefully be a more useful and utilized tool going forward. As I presented to the general plan on the environmental element, one of the questions that came up at the end was, when did you learn about the general plan? And it was like, well, when I had to start making this presentation. And I'd been in my position for half of that general plan's existence and not yet heard of it because it wasn't tied into the annual strategic plans, which is where the budgetary priorities are established. So if you have that level of disconnect, from a functional perspective, how am I going to know what's going on back here with the general plan if the emphasis is on making my programmatic needs and asks tied to a strategic plan that's, completely different. So emphasizing the value of ecotourism in that kind of context is really valuable. And so that's one of the first places that I would recommend. There's a lot of other ways that you can, and they're different tools, different opportunities. There's single-day events like the Granite Creek Cleanup. It's tied in with Earth Day this year. We'll be there for sure. That's always a good one. If you see something that doesn't look right, let us know. That's really a critical one. I am 3 years into a pollution case with a commercial outfit now that's just gone to legal. It takes time, but it does get resolved. And we're still working towards that now through the legal means. But if you see something, this is an online reporting form. You can also call Public Works at any time. And once I get this, it comes to multiple people in the department and we go out and investigate right away. And so if you do happen to see something that doesn't look right, whether it's wildcat dumping or somebody pouring paint down a storm drain or anything of that nature, or even if you're not sure, let us know so that we can go out and figure out if this is just a one-off, we can do some outreach and education, or is this something that's an ongoing and perpetual kind of pollutant source that is damaging our waters and our habitats. Resources, the Prescott Water, the rainwater harvesting manual is there. It's a free PDF download, and so if you are looking for more direction, that's when you can read at your leisure, either through the PDF document or online. And we also have a bunch of other things that was done. The Prescott Creek Care Stewardship is a pretty good one, and that it covers multiple facets of impacts to our creeks. Citizen science is one that I've been playing with for a while, and it's hard. Coming from a place like Ramsey Canyon Preserve that had an incredible volunteer corps, it was also very unwieldy. And we constantly were having to evaluate is this worth the effort we're putting into it in terms of what is the benefit to the habitat that we're dealing with here? So making sure that we have that right balance, that we're not creating it just to say that we did it, but that we're actually seeing a larger benefit, and that comes in many forms. So I've actually had conversations with Megan Smart at ADEQ, who runs our citizen science, Water Smart outreach, or Water Watch outreach. And so this is something that they have in place already so that you can report anytime you want on a mobile phone app about what you're seeing out there. And so that's a great thing to do. I've been in touch with them about doing lake monitoring now that we're getting some aerators in, and can we get a better data set so that we can monitor the performance of these devices or these treatments as they happen over time. And they actually discouraged lake monitoring as a citizen science. It's just a little bit unwieldy in that there's specialized equipment and practical standard operating procedures for that isn't like when we go out and just do a grab sample for E. coli and Granite Creek. So it's a little bit more challenging to do that effectively. That doesn't mean that we're not going to consider it. There's components of it that we can do, looking at turbidity with Secchi discs, getting DO levels at multiple points within the water column. There's some things that we can do. We just have to figure out if it makes sense and what does it look like. Just for context and a little bit to Gary's point, there's one of me right now. We're trying to hire my assistant who recently left. So there's two in total. And that is challenging at times. Yeah. So the other opportunity is we're still not sure what some of the green stormwater infrastructure ones are like, particularly with regards to training for residents. Anybody who's just curious about learning more about these features, having them set up at some of these sites where we have existing stuff and pointing out, hey, thumbs up, good feature here, not so much there. And then also the Penn Eastwood, I'm hoping to get something together for that in the springtime. And once I have an idea of what that looks like, I'll be broadcasting far and wide. And beyond that, if you have ideas, you can always contact me. And that's where I'm at. And with that, I'll turn it over for any and all questions. Yes?
On the Penn Street pond?
Yeah.
What's on the bottom?
The bottom is, so the very bottom or base of that basin is dirt.
Just dirt?
Dirt. The hill slopes have an erosion control mattress that is it's not a permanent feature, in that what that does is we get really significant erosion with monsoon storms. So the idea is you scarify the slope, you seed it, or hydro seed it depending, and then you put that over it, and it does a couple of things. Almost all of the native grasses need 10 to 14 days of continuous moisture in order to germinate. And so that helps retain the soil moisture and keep soil temperatures up a little bit. So it helps with that kind of germination. It also prevents the erosion that just happens from precipitation hitting and going down. So you don't see those large kind of rills forming as well. And so ideally, the timing of it wasn't great this past fall, in that we kind of put it down right at the end of the growing season. We did have quite a few wildflowers popping up through it, but hopefully this spring we'll start seeing some more, and that will get augmented to hopefully have that mattress kind of disappear into the background, and it should be a nice hairy with grasses and wildflowers on the slopes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Anything?
I'm going to take this time to do an announcement. Earth Day this year, April 20th on Cortez Street. Matt will be there, Leslie will be there. This year, more than ever, we're challenging the people who have booths to convey a feeling of being responsible to the participants. The overall theme is think globally, act locally.
Yep, we're there every year.
I have a question.
Yep.
So I've given up kayaking on Willow Lake because it's just sludge.
Yeah.
Is there any thought about the future of Willow Lake?
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up.
Because all of this, the emphasis on Watson.
Yeah, and actually a colleague of mine has been spearheading that one, and one of the things from the past general plan was to have lake management plans for both. We had the Watson Lake one that was very much pollutant focused. There has been effort to do one for Willow Lake, and to do it more comprehensively, to look at multiple aspects of it, from the water quality that goes into recharge to the water quality side of it, the recreation side of it. I know that there's some really decadent riparian forests and portions of it that have a soft spot for many of you, and hold some really cool critters as well. And so the idea is to work collaboratively with a consultant, and we're internally discussing putting something like that back out to bid, or figure out what the appropriate method is to get a consultant on board that can help navigate us through that process, so that water quality, water quantity, angling and paddling opportunities are considered. Game and Fish has a fishery management plan for that, and has suggested a number of different things, and how does that square with other management priorities of it. That's something that we would anticipate going forward within the next year, but I don't know what that will look like. And so,
So waterfowl hold over in the winter.
yeah,
So I mean, for people who are birding, it's an ideal place to be.
it is, but then we start talking about things like, well, should we really have resident Canadian geese? And what do they do to our pollutant levels? You know, some of the early discussions in the Watson Lake Management Plan actually talked about taking a much more aggressive approach with that, whether it was needling or oiling or other things with.
Part of the problem is that there are several people who feed the geese down there.
Yeah,
So it makes them, it's their home now.
yeah. Yeah, and that's that whole other component to it that we also have to make sure we're paying attention to, or we're not doing the job. Anything else?
From all of us, Matt, I'm not sure this is working. Am I? Okay. I want to thank you for taking the time. You have an awful lot to do, and I don't think I appreciated how complex all the issues that we care about really are. And thank you for being a support to Prescott Audubon over these years, and for putting up with all this. So thank you all for coming, and what's the next program? That I don't know. Anybody? Nancy, what's the next program? Do we know?